What's up everybody? Today we talk about the frame, how we selected the right frame for this build, and everything that goes into the suspension and the rear end. And after getting inside the body, taking some measurements, seeing how large this body is, it's a good foot wider than like a 32 Ford. And because it's larger, we now have options for frames. We can go a little larger, a little longer, a little wider, and look for something that we could either just buy or buy and cut and adapt or lengthen or shorten. So we have plenty of options for what we're looking for. When we started looking, you go to all the frame builders and you see the costs of all of them, what you get with each frame. Can you buy an old one? Can you buy a new one? What's the price ranges? And we found that finding an old frame like the one that we had and we already sold and got rid of, it ends up costing more, believe it or not, to start with an old frame rail set and then buy a new rear end kit and a new front end kit to try to make your custom hot rod frame. And then we went to many different builders and we actually found that Speedway Motors, they're not sponsored, but we went to their site and there's weld your own frame kits for T-buckets, for 32 Fords, for like shoebox Chevys. They have frames for everything. They source them from various builders and they offer a great price on them. And the inside of this body, it's about 100 inches long. It's about 4.5 feet wide. So it's pretty large. We have room to cut the floor out and put it basically on any body we want. Because remember, the goal of this is to channel it and drop it on whatever frame as low as we can get it. Because my dream is a Lakester that is dropped. Not necessarily like to the floor, but I don't want to be able to put more than a couple hands height from the floor to the body when it's done. And with the available frames that you can buy, there's different front ends, there's different rear ends, there's different suspensions, full independent, leaf spring, coilovers. You can mix and match all these different parts, which I thought was really cool. And it allowed you to also buy within your budget. So this next purchase is the single largest purchase of this build. It totaled around $4,000, where you get a rear end, a rear suspension, the coilover kit, you get the front suspension, all the brakes, all the brake hardware, everything. So you can make a full rolling chassis, even if it's not the right dimension. So what you'll notice is all the parts that we pieced together to get our chassis and suspension don't actually fit the body. So it's not correct for this build, because this build, remember, is a 4-seat Lakester, which doesn't exist. Nobody has built that. And if they have, it's using original frame, chopping up stuff. So when we're trying to find a good new frame that's laser cut, CNC welded, and totally stout, but still light, because I didn't want a heavy vehicle. This is where you get into choosing what you want to cut up, because we're going to buy something to cut up again. And that's kind of the theme of this whole project, is nothing ever just fit. So we cut the top off, cut the body apart. It's all chopped. And then same thing with the frame. So you're going into this purchase with a mindset of what could fit my build with my abilities to either shorten or stretch a frame to match this body, which is much larger than a 32 Ford. And the 32 Ford frame from Speedway is outsourced. They don't build it, but they have a chassis builder. It's a really cool deal. It's laser cut, 1/8 inch steel. They fully weld it in a frame jig, and you can buy it. It's like $1,500. So that was half of this budget for this specific frame purchase. And then you have your options for suspension and front end and rear end. So I would have loved to afford a Mustang front end independent suspension with coilovers up there. It was just added another $1,500 to the bill. So I went with the Springer front end. It's just the classic Springer 32 Ford front suspension, and it has a leaf spring set in there that provides the springing. And then you get your shocks, you get your headlight bucket mounts, you get a ton of stuff with this kit. And then for the rear end, you have leaf spring options again, you have 4-link, 3-link, you have all these different options. And then it's not just the suspension in the rear, it's also what rear end you're going to use. So you start playing with the combination of rear end and the rear suspension that you can buy. And I pieced together a Currie 9-inch rear end with a 4-link that matches this body, and it's kind of comes as a kit. So they pre-selected all these parts to fit together and bolt together. And that Currie rear end is very expensive. So that was the single part of this build where you're questioning which rear end do you use. Could I go to a junkyard and get like a Ford Explorer rear end, or a Ranger rear end, or some like a Chevy truck rear end? You can. Again, my welding capabilities, I'm just learning how to weld with this body. You saw in the last video that it's okay. So it's not the best to make a decision on something you have to cut down. I'm sure if I tried, I could have learned it. At this point, I wanted to just get a roller, so I was looking for something kind of out of the box. So that's why we went with that Currie 9-inch. When you're ordering the frame, you have your options of engines. We already started with the engine, so it's a small block Chevy. Even though it's an LT1, it's the exact same mount to the frame as a small block 350. So that's the frame mounts that I selected. I chose my front end, my rear end, and the rear suspension. It came with some coilovers for the back. And like I said, for $4,000, I couldn't have built this on my own and found all these parts. It was like a package deal, and I just clicked buy and then waited, because that was kind of the deal on this. The frames are built to order. I think now they have some in stock. Last time I was on their site, they have some just sitting around. But remember, this is the beginning of the pandemic. There was nobody showing up to work. And this is when I was buying everything. So this frame was, it took like 2 or 3 months after clicking buy for it to get built. And then it took another 2 weeks to get shipped to me. And by that time, mind you, it's kind of out of order, our timeline. I did these purchases while this project started, doing the engine work. So during the engine work is when I started thinking about buying the donor car and the frame at the same time. So while I had those couple of months working on the body in the previous episode, all this was already ordered, and those are the months that passed while I was working on the body, while all this frame stuff was ordered and then starting to show up. And if you have a keen eye, you can see while I was doing the body work, some of these parts started piling up in the garage next to the body, and that's because they slowly came in. Like I think the Currie rear end was in stock. That showed up within a week on a pallet. And then the front end showed up. The brakes started showing up. It's full disc brakes all the way around. All those parts started coming in. The shocks started coming in. And the last thing to show up was that frame. The steering is manual. I didn't want power assisted. I wanted this to be a raw experience. So it's a basic steering box that bolts to the side of the frame. And it's a little hot rod setup, but it's super cool. It turns really easy after getting us all in and getting the steering column in. You'll see that it's the right steering setup for this car. It's so light, you don't need power. You could have went power assisted, power brakes, all that kind of stuff. Same thing with brakes. During the selection of this frame, it's already provisioned for a steering box and a master cylinder setup. So you add those to the cart as well, and then it all just bolts together. And yeah, when I started this project, I wanted to be involved in every aspect of the build. And even though some of this stuff is bolt-on, it simplified the build to an extent where I could focus on things I wanted to do, and things that didn't necessarily take me so far out of my comfort zone that could cause like a risk of safety, especially with the brakes and the steering. You could have hobbled together something cool with maybe an electric steering rack or power assist brakes, but I didn't want to do that. I just, after seeing on Speedway's site that you can buy a 32 frame with all those parts already bolt in and they're good and safe, so I just went with those. And when you start looking at the frame, it's a puzzle piece to start. We started with the front end. It was really good. The instructions were fine. You take everything out of its boxes, you lay it out. I learned that in this instance, the instructions were good enough to tell you kind of where things go, but not necessarily how to put it together, if that makes sense. They tell you how many bolts you get, what they're for, but the diagrams don't tell you. It's not like IKEA where they tell you exactly where they go and show you where the nuts and bolts go. So you're kind of on your own with that. So you're playing a little bit of guessing, but it was all easy. We just laid everything out on the floor, took inventory of all the parts, and then started assembling. With the front end, straightforward. It's a kingpin setup. The front axle is a 6-inch drop front axle, and then the spindles are another 2-inch drop. So total of 8 inches drop in the front end, and that achieves my goals in the front, where when it's all said and done, the front radiator shroud should only be a few inches off the ground, and that's perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. So with that 8-inch drop, it really brings that, it tucks the engine down to where the oil pan's just 5-6 inches off the ground, and then you can make the front radiator shroud a little lower after you're getting to that part in the build. And it went together smoothly. The brakes were really cool. They're off of a 70s Mustang. Same thing with the rear. It's all 70s Mustang disc brakes and calipers. So really easy to work on. You just have to know the basics of preload on that bearing in the front wheel and the hub, and just assemble it all. And the lug pattern that we chose for all this is 5 on 4 3/4. So that allows us to have a huge selection of wheels that we can choose from in the future. So you'll see throughout this build various wheels going on just to move the car around the garage. I was just testing out what I thought would look good, what I might want, and finally where we settled is a nice set of modern wheels that bolt right up to that. Real simple at the front end, bolted together, done. Moved on to the back, and it's just like the front end. We took everything out of the boxes, took inventory, and it's a 4-link. So everything except for the panhard bar and the coilover brackets on the Currie 9-inch rear, everything was bolted together. And to measure all this, it was interesting. We had the front end done. We had to actually place in the engine to be able to clock that rear end to match the transmission snout coming out, to make sure that the degrees were equal yet opposite, and we could lock in a position for the rear end. And after getting the frame on jack stands, getting it pretty level, or at least level to the floor so that we have a reference with the floor to make measurements, we got the frame straight and parallel with the floor, and then we got the transmission and engine in, and got the rear end on jack stands in the back and clocked it. And it's interesting, everything I read online was equal but opposite degrees. So if you're 2 degrees on the snout of the transmission, you should be -2 degrees on the rear end, so that they cancel each other out, so there's no harmonic noises and vibration. I used this analog magnetic dial indicator that just tells you the degree. It's like a magnetic degree wheel, whatever you find on Amazon or go to the auto parts store. It got us there. This thing is, I don't know if it was intended by the frame builder, but the transmission was nearly 0 degrees. It was like a ½ degree positive. So the rear end was ½ degree negative when we got it all said and done. So it's basically flat. And I saw some conflicting theories about you shouldn't be 0 straight because that might have some vibration. It's good to have a degree or two, but we ended up with like a ½ degree off between the rear end and the transmission. We'll find out when we drive it, but it's basically the way they built this frame, and the transmission mount in there, it's flat. It's basically flat. So it worked out, but once you clock the rear end and we got it in the right position, this here was actually my very first weld. Even though in the video before I was talking about learning to weld, funny enough, the first thing I welded in my life was this panhard bar bracket that went onto the Currie 9-inch rear end. I'm using a basic welder from Harbor Freight, like I think it's titanium or something like that's the brand. I just read the manual of thickness of the metal and what to set the dial at, and it was pretty close. It was spot on. You can see this is my first weld. For my very first weld, it was fine. The welder recommended the right settings, so I'm like, okay, well, just try it on the rear end. What could be the worst thing that happens? I have to grind it off and redo it. So take a look at that weld. I mean, it got nice heat, nice penetration. That rear end's like a 1/4 inch thick wall, and then that bracket was at least 1/8 inch thick, if not a little bit thicker, and it did great. So that's my very first weld right there. So the panhard bar was welded in. Remember, this is all clocked in place. I tacked in the suspension brackets for the coilovers and for the 4-link. Those are on each side. There's a nice C-notch in those brackets, so you get them in place. We tacked them in and then blew out the rear end, took it out off the jack stands, and I fully welded this thing in away from the car. After it was fully welded in, slid the rear end back under the car, and we started messing with the 4-link bars and the panhard bar and tried doing all of our measurements to get those equal. And we were squaring the front suspension spindles and discs to the rear one to try to clock them. We got it tracking true, at least from a measurement perspective. It's perfectly square to go down the road. This whole thing's not cockeyed, because it's like unlimited adjustments on these things. The front suspension, there's a Heim joint on both sides. There's actually like 3 Heim joints, so that in the front you can do caster and camber and toe a little bit, but caster and camber, and then I guess tracking for the whole front suspension. Same thing in the rear. You can adjust that angle of the rear end, how it is left and right, and dial it all in. So at least with the 2 tape measures that are exact same brand from the same manufacturer, same length, we had 2 tape measures and just spent hours and hours twisting some Heim joints here, twisting there, adjusting everything to get it as square as you could. I think the final alignment is going to have to be done by a professional, but at least with our tape measures, there's maybe, if a 1/16 of an inch off anywhere, that's the most that we could get it down to. And you'll see the frame, it's a roller now, so you have the front end, rear end, brakes, all that on there. So it's a full roller, but it's not the right size for this body that we have. So that's where we start thinking, okay, we got this thing together, we're gonna have to cut it because it's too short. It's like a good 20 inches too short for this build. So that's what we get into right now. And let's go back to the body real quick. You see how long this thing is. It's a good 100-ish inches. I think it's 96 or something inches long, just the body. And you have to remember the engine and radiator cowl shroud are forward, so it's still going to be a long car. I mean, if it's in a 2-car garage, it's still going to be 120, 130 plus inches long total. So that's fine. 120 inches, I'm cool with that. It'll fit in the garage no matter where I live in life. So it'll always come with me and fit somewhere. But we have to stretch this frame somehow. So there weren't any good options when buying frames to get longer, to shorten, because I would have felt more comfortable shortening. But after thinking about it and seeing a ton of other people stretch frames or shorten frames, it's the same process. We got this frame ready. We got our measurements. Ended up being 18.5 inches of stretch we needed to add into this frame. And 18.5 inches is a lot. I mean, you're talking, nearly 2 feet we're adding to this frame. That gives us a lot of questions we have to answer. We have to figure out what material was the frame made of? What material do we want to stretch with? How are we going to brace this thing so it's not out of square after we stretch it? How do we stretch it so that it's still parallel at the end of the day? And you can't just stretch a frame it's not perfectly parallel and square to begin with parallel and square tubing. So we had to come up with a game plan where you can't just go add some tubing on this thing and stretch it. Because when you go look at this frame, it looks like a ladder frame, but the way 32 Fords are, the frame's actually narrower in the front than in the rear. And because it's narrower in the front than the rear, when you decide I need to stretch this thing, somewhere in between the transmission and the rear end is where your cut's going to be. Because you don't want to mess with the rear end geometry. You don't want to mess with anything in the front end. So you have a good 2-3 feet to say, I'm making my cut somewhere there. And after coming up with a game plan, measuring, we found that a good 1 foot behind the transmission mount, and it ends up being about 8 to 10 inches in front of the rear 4-link bracket is the best place for us. And we didn't just cut into it. We first thought, how do you brace this thing? So you'll see we welded in bracing, and we had a ton of that 1-inch square tube that we used for bracing here too. It's 1/8 inch wall thick, so it's super stout stuff. We welded in those braces around where our cut would be. And then here's the scary part. We get our braces in, we have a game plan of where our cut's going to be, and we cut it. I know it's like, it sounds simple, but we just cut apart our new $4,000 complete frame and suspension in half. Like, holy crap. We were like, I guess we're going for it. And in going for it, I mean, I have so many jack stands from this project that I'll never use again. We had 4 jack stands in the back, 4 jack stands in the front. And we had this thing, we pulled it apart, and you can see we now have a huge gap between the front half and the back half. And actually cutting it in half exposed how they built this frame at the frame builders. So you can see that it's all 1/8 inch new modern hot rolled material. So that's when we went to the metal store, we're like, okay, let's start with the same metal that they used. We went and got 1/8 inch plate. We had it cut to our right dimensions, and we were trying to come up with a game plan. We looked on many other places, other videos, other builders who have stretched frames and how they did it to add the metal back and get the right welds so that this thing's strong. One thing that we saw repeated time and time again with all the builders out there is they tended to do a lot of sleeving with rosette welds, and then on top of the main seams after the rosette welds, huge plates to just box it all in. So that's what we went with. We went with the same plan where we're like, okay, we'll get the 1/8 inch thick material. We'll sleeve it all the way inside, and then on the outside, we'll drill rosette welds. We'll drill holes with rosette welds, should I say, and weld it in. So you're welding it in from basically the inside through the rosette welds, and then you're welding all those seams of all the plates that you sleeved in to the existing frame on both sides. And then you're capping it all with more 1/8 inch thick plates. In this instance, we did squares that were heavy duty on each of the seams. So those were welded in place at the seam level on top of the rosette welds after we ground them flat. So the chop turned from 1 cut line to now 2 that we had to support with sleeving, rosette welds, and plating on this thing. It's not going anywhere. After seeing enough videos of how other people have done it, it's clear why they do it this method, because those rosette welds keep the sleeving part from moving inside, and then you weld all the seams shut. That provides its initial tubing strength, and then all the plates that you go over the seams with and weld those in, there's no chance this thing's going to come apart. I actually think the stretched part of the frame is the strongest part of this frame after we're done with it, because there's so much weld in there. There's So much material. I mean, it's strong. And like I was saying before, that this frame isn't parallel, so we had to play with some geometry of when we sleeve it and stretch it, you'll see that the frame, I don't know if it's clear in the photo, but the frame is no longer parallel in a straight shot. It kind of jogs a little, because when you're stretching a frame that is uneven widths from beginning to end, it's not a straight shot. So you can't just pull back this frame and then that same continuous line occurs. It actually now jogs a little bit to connect the rear and the front, but that's fine. That was the part of sleeving. The inside of each of the sleeves were bent a little so that they, when they went into the frame, they were actually pressed up against the inside wall of the original frame. And then the rosette welds were really just to hold it in place. But we bent those plates so that the sleeving matched the front and rear angles of the frame. And the only thing I would say that was kind of a pain was welding the bottom seams. I don't know, welding upside down, it must be a thing. It's like a pain in the ass. The sparks are flying everywhere. You crank up your shielding gas. You try to keep it from going everywhere, but the bottom side is probably the ugliest welds, but they're in there. They were hot. It's just welding upside down is terrible. The rest of it looks great, top, sides, but as soon as you get underneath, those welds are kind of all over, but it's really good, completely solid. We triple checked everything, and there's no issues with the welds. So I think it's super strong now. You can see now that the frame is completed. It's stretched. It's the right length. We took the body on and off a few times to make sure it was the right length, and we don't have any frame issues when we're ready to go mate it up and start cutting the floor out of the body. That's it for this episode. Super awesome to cut something in half, stretch it, connect it back together, and add some strength back. And I can say I stretched a frame in my life. I never thought I'd be able to do this, but it worked out. Everything is coming together perfect. In the next episode, we're going to talk about some of these small projects that are building up. So in the background of all these photos that you keep seeing, there's parts piling up for all these small projects. There's radiators showing up. There's headlight buckets showing up. There's the brake line kit, steering box. All that stuff keeps showing up. So in the meantime, while we're working on these big projects to try to marry the frame and the body, all this other stuff starts showing up. So there's probably a good 5, 6, 7 episodes of all these small things before we get to a point where we can take the body and actually get it on the frame and then show you how we did that. So stick around for those episodes and see you next time.